The US economy is a global linchpin, but in 2025, cracks are forming. A looming recession could send shockwaves worldwide, toppling nations that lean too heavily on American support. Today, we're exposing 10 countries teetering on the edge of collapse if the US falls into economic chaos. This isn't just about numbers, it's about survival. Let's begin with Ukraine, a nation on the brink. Ukraine's survival against Russia's invasion, ongoing since 2022, is tethered to US aid, which reached $113 billion by mid-2025, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This lifeline funds everything from HIMARS rocket systems and Javelin missiles to salaries for teachers and pensions for the elderly, sustaining a war-torn economy with a GDP down 30% since the conflict began. A U.S. recession, flagged at 60% likelihood by J.P. Morgan's April 2025 report, would force Washington to tighten its belt, potentially slashing aid by 30%, as warned by the Heritage Foundation in March 2025. Without these funds, Ukraine's military could run out of ammunition within months, leaving cities like Kharkiv and Odessa vulnerable to Russian advances. Europe, strained by 3% inflation and energy prices, up 12% since 2024 per Eurostat, lacks the capacity to bridge the gap. Germany and France combined pledged only $20 billion in 2025. Russia, despite its own economic struggles, could seize this moment, with Putin's April 2025 rhetoric hinting at a final push to annex Donbass or seize Black Sea ports. Ukraine's 20% hyperinflation in Q1 2025, coupled with a UA hryvnia devaluation of 25%, already squeezes civilians, and an aid cutoff could spark mass protests, reminiscent of the 2014 Maidan uprising. Historically, Ukraine's post-Soviet 1990s saw 80% GDP collapse. Today, a U.S. recession could push it toward Russian occupation or a frozen conflict, erasing its sovereignty. The human toll, 10 million displaced since 2022, could double, with refugee waves overwhelming Poland and Romania, destabilizing Eastern Europe. Now, turn to Canada, the northern giant. Canada's $2 trillion economy is practically an extension of the U.S., with 75% of its exports, crude oil, auto parts, lumber, flowing south, accounting for 30% of its GDP. A U.S. recession would obliterate American consumer demand, with Deloitte's Q1 2025 if forecast, projecting a 2.5% drop in Canadian export growth, potentially shaving 1.5% off GDP. Trump's March 2025 tariffs, imposing a 25% levy on Canadian goods, threatened to choke industries like Alberta's oil sands, which supply 4 million barrels daily to U.S. refineries, and Ontario's auto sector, employing 120,000 workers. The Canadian dollar, down 12% against the U.S. dollar in 2025, fuels 4% inflation, eroding purchasing power for 40 million Canadians, per Statistics Canada. Historically, Canada's 1982 recession, tied to U.S. downturns, saw unemployment hit 11%. Today, 6.5% could climb to 9%, with the Bank of Canada warning of 200,000 job losses. Small businesses, comprising 50% of Canada's economy, face rising costs, with 20% at risk of bankruptcy per the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Political fractures deepen as provinces like Quebec, already pushing for autonomy, demand federal bailouts, echoing the 1995 referendum's separatist fervor. Consumer confidence, down 15% in April 2025 per the University of Michigan, signals a looming spending freeze. Canada's social safety nets, strained by a 7% budget deficit, could buckle, pushing healthcare wait times, already 30 weeks, higher, sparking public unrest. A U.S. recession could drag Canada into a crisis rivaling the 1930s, with food bank usage up 25% in 2024, potentially doubling. Picture Mexico's vibrant chaos. Mexico's $1.5 trillion economy is lashed to the U.S., with 80% of its exports, cars, electronics, avocados, heading north, driving 35% of its GDP. The 2020 USMCA trade deal promised stability, but 2025's tariff wars, including Trump's April 2025 Liberation Day, 25% tax on Mexican autos, threatened to cripple factories in Tijuana and Monterrey, where U.S. firms like Ford and GM employ 100,000 workers. Deloitte's Q1 2025 forecast predicts a 2% export contraction, potentially cutting GDP growth from 2.5% to 0.5%. The peso, down 15% in 2025, drives 5% inflation per Banco de Mexico, hitting 130 million consumers. Remittances from Mexican workers in the U.S., $60 billion annually, account for 4% of GDP and support 20% of rural households. A U.S. job market crash could have these flows, pushing 5 million more into poverty per the World Bank. The 1994 peso crisis saw a 50% devaluation and 20% unemployment. Today, a similar collapse could overwhelm Mexico's $50 billion reserves. Cartel violence, up 15% in 2024, could surge as economic desperation fuels drug trafficking and extortion, destabilizing cities like Juarez and Culiacan. Mexico's government, facing a 7% budget deficit in 2025, might raise taxes, sparking protests like the 2017 gas price riots, which drew 500,000 marchers. Historically, Mexico's 1980s debt crisis required IMF bailouts. Now, with public debt at 55% of GDP, a U.S. recession could topple its democracy, empowering populist or authoritarian factions. Shift to China, a titan with hidden cracks. China's $18 trillion economy, the world's second largest, leans on U.S. consumers for 20% of its exports. Smartphones, clothing, toys, generating $600 billion annually. U.S. tariffs soaring to 145% in 2025 per J.P. Morgan could slash China's growth to 4.1% per the IMF's April forecast, a sharp fall from 8% pre-COVID. A U.S. recession would gut demand, idling factories in Shenzhen and Guangzhou, where 10 million workers produce 30% of global electronics. China's property sector, reeling since Evergrande's 2021 collapse, faces a $2 trillion debt crisis, with 30% of developers at risk, per Bloomberg. Retaliatory Chinese tariffs, like April 2025's 34% on U.S. goods, spike inflation to 3%, hitting 1.4 billion consumers. Historically, China's 1989 economic slowdown fueled Tiananmen Square protests. Today, 10% youth unemployment, affecting 20 million, could spark urban unrest, especially in Tier 2 cities like Chengdu. Beijing's $1 trillion stimulus in March 2025 aims to stabilize, but falling commodity prices, oil and copper down 15%, hurt imports. U.S. foreign direct investment, $100 billion annually, could dry up, starving tech hubs like Shanghai. China's $3 trillion debt-to-GDP ratio, up 20% since 2020, limits fiscal room. The 2008 global recession saw China's exports drop 25%. A U.S. downturn could repeat this, undermining Xi's Chinese dream and risking social control in a nation where 500,000 protests occur annually. Now, imagine South Korea's neon-lit streets. South Korea's $1.7 trillion economy thrives on U.S. demand for semiconductors, cars, and smartphones, accounting for 15% of GDP and $100 billion in exports. A U.S. recession would slash orders for Samsung and Hyundai, with Deloitte's 2025 outlook forecasting a 2% export contraction, potentially wiping out 1% of GDP. The Kospi Index, down 5% in April 2025, reflects investor panic. South Korea's $1.5 trillion foreign debt, 80% of GDP, risks capital flight if the US dollar surges, echoing the 1997 Asian financial crisis's 50% won devaluation. The won, down 10% in 2025, drives 3% inflation per the Bank of Korea. Geopolitically, a weakened U.S. economy could cut military support, emboldening North Korea, whose 2025 missile tests are up 20%. Per CIPRI, small businesses, 40% of Seoul's economy, face 20% closure risks, and 8% youth unemployment could hit 12%, affecting 1 million young Koreans, per the Korea Economic Institute. The 1980s democratization survived economic pain, but 2025's social fabric could fray, with 30% of citizens reporting mental health strain, per a 2024 Seoul National University study. South Korea's $600 billion export sector, half its economy, could shrink, pushing the government toward austerity, sparking protests like 2016's Park Geun-hye rallies, and threatening its tech-driven prosperity. Cross to Japan, a land of quiet strength. Japan's $4 trillion economy, the world's fourth largest, exports cars, machinery, and electronics to the U.S., its second biggest market, generating $70 billion annually. A U.S. recession would hammer Toyota and Sony, with the Nikkei 225 down 7% in April 2025, its worst drop since 2020. The IMF's 0.6% growth forecast reflects an aging population and stagnant domestic demand, with 30% of 125 million citizens over 65. The yen, down 10% in quarter 1 2025, fuels 3% inflation, squeezing households, per the Bank of Japan. Japan's $4 trillion public debt, 250% of GDP, limits stimulus, and rising U.S. Treasury yields spike borrowing costs by 1%, costing $40 billion annually. The 1990s lost decade saw deflation cripple growth. A U.S. downturn could trigger a sequel, with 2.5% unemployment rising to 4%, affecting 2 million workers. Small firms, 70% of jobs, face 20% closure risks, per Japan's Ministry of Economy. Historically, Japan's 2011 earthquake recovery leaned on U.S. trade. Without it, 2025 could see deflationary spirals, with consumer prices falling 1%, per Nomura. Political stability, a post-WLP hallmark, could waver as Abe's LDP faces 2025 election challenges, with opposition exploiting economic pain, potentially shifting Japan's U.S.-aligned foreign policy. Let's explore Brazil, a tropical powerhouse. Brazil's $2 trillion economy hinges on exporting soy, beef, and iron ore to the U.S., its top buyer, generating $50 billion annually. A U.S. recession would crash commodity prices, copper down 15% in 2025, devaluing the real by 10%, per Goldman Sachs, and cutting GDP growth to 2.1%, per the IMF. Trump's 2025 tariffs disrupt Bolsonaro's U.S.-aligned trade policies, slashing exports by 15%. Deforestation, up 10% in 2024, could surge as economic desperation drives illegal logging, with 20,000 square kilometers lost annually, per INPE. Inflation, at 4.5% in Q1 2025, hits the urban poor, 20% of 200 million people, with food prices up 10%. The 1980s debt crisis saw 1,000% hyperinflation. Today, 7% unemployment could hit 10%, affecting 10 million workers, per IBGE. Protests like 2013's bus fare riots with 1 million marchers could erupt, fueled by 2022 election disputes lingering tensions. Brazil's $600 billion public debt, 80% of GDP, limits fiscal relief, and a 5% budget deficit strains social programs, with Bolsa Familia covering 20 million families. A U.S. recession could push Brazil toward authoritarianism, as populist leaders exploit economic despair, threatening its democracy. Now, envision Germany's industrial heart. Germany's $4.5 trillion economy, Europe's largest, sends cars, chemicals, and machinery to the U.S., its second largest market, worth $150 billion annually. A U.S. recession would slash demand, with the IMF projecting zero growth in 2025. Trump's 10% universal tariff, announced in April, hits Volkswagen and BMW, while EU retaliatory tariffs risk a trade war, cutting exports by 10%, per IFO Institute. Germany's energy crisis, lingering from 2022's Russia-Ukraine fallout, sees gas prices up 12%, costing industry $50 billion. The DAX index, down 4% in March 2025, signals fear. The 2009 recession saw a 5% GDP drop tied to US subprime. Today, a $1 trillion trade surplus could shrink by 20%. Unemployment, at 3.5%, could hit 5%, affecting 2 million workers, boosting far-right AfD support, up 10% in 2025 polls. Germany's post-WWII export model relies on US demand. A recession could cut industrial output by 15%, per DIW Berlin, straining EU cohesion. Mittelstand firms, 60% of jobs, face 25% bankruptcy risks, and 4% inflation squeezes 84 million consumers. Political instability, unseen since the 1970s, could emerge, with Scholz's coalition faltering, threatening Germany's role as Europe's economic anchor. Let's sail to Australia, a resource-rich giant. Australia's $1.6 trillion economy exports iron ore, coal, and gas to the US, worth $30 billion annually, but a US recession would crash commodity prices. Oil down 15% in 2025. The Aussie dollar, down 10%, fuels 4% inflation, hitting 26 million consumers, per RBA. The IMF's 1.2% growth forecast reflects tariff chaos, with Trump's tariffs disrupting US-Australia trade pacts. Australia's 2008 resilience leaned on China, but China's 2025 slowdown offers no fallback. Small businesses, 40% of jobs, face 20% closure risks, affecting 1 million workers, per the Australian Chamber. Geopolitically, US military cuts could expose Australia to China's Pacific ambitions, with 2025 naval drills up 15%, per ASPI. The 1970s stagflation saw 6% unemployment. Today, 5% could hit 7%, per ABS, with 2025 500,000 job losses. Australia's $800 billion public debt, 50% of GDP, limits relief, and a 5% budget deficit strains healthcare, with hospital wait times up 20%. A US recession could dim Australia's prosperity, sparking urban protests and weakening its US alliance. If you found this video eye-opening, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more breakdowns on global travel, visa bans, and what's really happening around the world. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.